So on the 21st of December, the Productivity Commission handed down its report into the Workplace Relations Framework. This had originally been called for by the then Abbott government. The then Treasurer Joe Hockey on the 19th of December sent terms of reference to the Productivity Commission setting out what they should look at. They were quite limited in nature, those terms, so the Productivity Commission was focusing on some key areas. There was then a period where submissions were open, where industry groups, associations, employers, employees, lawyers, etc. could put forward their thoughts for the Productivity Commission to consider. And then in August they released a draft report for comment, and then finally the final report in December. So there were a lot of issues touched on. It was over 1,000 pages long, but I think, there's a few key ones, including about unfair dismissals. One of the issues repeated throughout the report was that the Productivity Commission believes that the Fair Work Commission values process over substance, and one of those areas is unfair dismissals, where employers can be found to unfairly dismiss someone for a very minor procedural matter involved in a termination, and they believe, the Productivity Commission, that shouldn't be the case. They've recommended that instead of finding an unfair dismissal and potentially reinstating or compensating an employee, that there should be some other steps, such as providing information to employers that perhaps stuff up the procedure, or if there's a repeat offender, that they could potentially be penalised with a fine rather than compensation being awarded to an employee.
It's interesting. You can see why many employers are concerned about that it seems on its face to be a significant sanction. I think in practice it's very rare that an employee would take such a matter all the way to the Fair Work Commission in any event. I think in practical terms, the processes that are already in place in relation to the conciliations, when it becomes very clear to the Commission's officers that it's a matter which is only procedural and doesn't have a substantive fairness element, I think the pressure is pretty strong for the matter to go away in any event.
One of the other issues that the Productivity Commission also looked at was penalty rates, which has received quite a lot of media attention over the last 12 months. The Productivity Commission recommended that Sunday penalty rates should be removed, and that there should be an overall weekend penalty rate instead of a Saturday rate and a Sunday penalty rate. They were for particular industries, including hospitality, entertainment, retail and restaurants. And the Productivity Commission looked quite significantly at other parties that are often ignored or don't get heard, including the consumers, underemployed and the unemployed. So for certain industries, they recommend that there's only one penalty rate over the weekend.
And I think it was quite an interesting discussion, that because usually in the media it's strictly a kind of union versus employer debate that goes on with penalty rates. So looking at things like, could more people be employed, the underemployed, people that want to work more, or people that are in fact not employed and looking for a job, if rates were a little bit lower on Sundays, would that help with employment rates or hours that people work, which I think is quite interesting.
And I also think although people are reluctant to touch on it, there's just a cultural issue. There's a shift. Sunday's no longer, for the vast majority of Australians, any more different a day than Saturday. Both days are significantly different to the weekdays, but there's no real argument, in my mind at least, that can be put forward to saying that Sunday should be treated too differently from Saturday in 2015.
Exactly.
I know it's a topic that does provoke emotional responses, but
they looked at public holidays as well, and should there be a change around that? But the difference that they noted is that public holidays, even if it's not, you know, people necessarily celebrating what that day is for, are quite significant in terms of just family events and, you know, families getting together that otherwise they wouldn't generally
it's
on the
partly
weekend.
because you don't have the other structured weekend activities. But for example, a lot of the leisure activities are just as common on your Sundays, your Saturday, in terms of sporting activities now. So it's very hard to justify the difference.
Yeah.
One of the recommendations which was made was that there should be a separate body from the Fair Work Commission, the Workplace Standards Commission, established in relation to minimum wages and award terms. The reasons for this, partly that the Fair Work Commission was seen as being too backward looking and focused on sort of past process, taking into account the interests of former awards, for example. We've seen a lot of this during the award modernisation process, where the aim for simplicity, though achieved to a certain degree, has been significantly eroded by the concerns members of the Commission have had for the past awards, and very strong campaigns have been put up in relation to the need from certain stakeholders to keep those awards. Personally, I don't like the idea of another body, just because we've had so many bodies in this area. It starts to get ridiculous. I think that what they need to do is legislate and change the way, if they went ahead with the recommendation, and change the way the matters are to be approached in relation to the Fair Work Commission, rather than just renaming things and thinking it'll make a difference and shuffling the people around because they've been appointed for such long periods under different statutory regimes that they'll have to find somewhere else for them. It just seems unnecessary.
And I mean, they did look very briefly in the report at, well, given that awards are so unique to Australia, is it something that we should consider getting rid of? But then they had so many submissions from employers that even in the award modernisation process, it was so expensive, you know, getting their head around what was required, changing contracts, getting advice, that to then completely get rid of awards would also be extremely expensive, because presumably something else would need to be put in their place.
I think they've got to follow a gradual process, but I think that possibly too much consideration was given in award modernisation to interests from all different sectors as they brought it all together, and too little to the fact that we just need to have a simplified process, to the point where during the 5-year transitionary period, it was probably one of the most difficult times ever for people to understand an award, and sometimes I think they just got to decide what they think is right and rip the Band-Aid off.
Exactly. And not have, you know, another further period of transition like they had for those 5 years.
And as I say, it's not in particular interest groups. Obviously the trade unions are a big one, but there are also employer groups and interests that are not prepared to take a rational approach as well at times.
Yeah. And I guess the other really important thing about the timing of this report is that it's probably going to be really positive for the Turnbull government in terms of helping to set their agenda for the upcoming election, and, you know, what their key industrial relation changes will be. So I think that this report's going to inform a lot of that.
Yes.